The first thing the CEO noticed was the dirt on his boots. The second was the toolbox in his hand. The third was the little girl standing beside him, clutching a worn purple backpack and trying desperately not to cry. But what the CEO could not see was the faded silver tag hidden beneath the single dad's work shirt, or the 7 letters engraved on it that once meant more than his entire company was worth. "You're worrying over nothing," the CEO said coldly as thunder rolled beyond the glass walls of the aviation control center. "You're a maintenance worker, not a pilot. Leave the decisions to people who actually belong in this room." The man lowered his eyes, swallowed his pride, and quietly stepped back. Nobody in that room knew that years earlier, those same words would have been impossible to say to him. Nobody knew that the quiet father standing there had once flown aircraft through storms that would have terrified the bravest executives alive. And nobody knew that before the day was over, the CEO would hear a secret call sign that would make her entire face go pale. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can change a life, forgiveness can heal old wounds, and second chances can arrive when we least expect them, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps our family keep bringing you stories about courage, compassion, and the people who discover that someone's worth can never be measured by a job title. The man's name was Everett Hale, a 41-year-old single father who had learned to live quietly after life had taken almost everything from him. He worked as a senior aircraft maintenance technician at North Star Aeronautics, a company that designed and serviced specialized aircraft for government agencies, emergency services, and international rescue organizations. Everett never talked about his past. To most employees, he was simply the dependable mechanic who arrived before everyone else, stayed after everyone left, and could diagnose an engine problem by listening to it for less than a minute. He had a patient manner and an almost stubborn calmness, but beneath that calm was exhaustion. Every morning, he packed lunch for his 9-year-old daughter, Maisie, tied her shoelaces when she was too distracted to do it herself, and drove her to school before heading to the hangar. Since his wife had died 3 years earlier after a sudden illness, Everett had become both parents to a little girl who still sometimes woke from dreams believing her mother was coming home. He had learned that being strong did not mean never crying. It meant wiping your tears before your child saw them and making breakfast anyway. That morning, Maisie had accompanied him to North Star because her school had closed early for a teacher training day. She sat quietly in a visitor's chair near the control room, drawing airplanes with colored pencils while Everett worked on an aircraft scheduled for a critical demonstration flight. The aircraft was the pride of North Star's new program, a highly advanced emergency response jet designed to operate in extreme weather. If the demonstration succeeded, the company would secure a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The pressure was enormous, and everyone knew the company's CEO, Celeste Whitmore, had staked her reputation on the flight. Celeste was brilliant, disciplined, and feared. She had built her career by refusing to tolerate mistakes, and she believed emotional people made dangerous decisions. She had spent years climbing through a world where every weakness became ammunition, and somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that kindness was simply another word for vulnerability. Everett had discovered a problem during his morning inspection. It was small enough that an inexperienced technician might have ignored it, but serious enough that Everett refused to sign the aircraft as flight-ready. He found an unusual vibration in the secondary control system, something that appeared harmless during normal testing but could become unpredictable under severe turbulence. He brought the data to the control center and calmly explained that the aircraft needed another inspection before the demonstration could proceed. Celeste barely looked at the report. She was surrounded by engineers, investors, military representatives, and senior executives, all waiting for the flight schedule. To her, Everett's warning sounded like another obstacle. She glanced at his grease-stained uniform and then at his worn toolbox, and her expression hardened. She told him that engineers had already cleared the system and that his job was to maintain the aircraft, not question the people running the company. Everett tried once more. He explained that the numbers were not consistent with the test results and that something was causing an intermittent response delay. Celeste became impatient. In front of everyone, she mocked him for being overly cautious and implied that he was nervous because he was only a maintenance worker who had never learned how to think like an executive. A few people looked uncomfortable, but nobody defended him. Everett stood there silently, feeling every eye in the room. Then Celeste ordered him to remove his objection from the report. When he refused to falsify a safety document, she threatened to fire him. Maisie had been watching from her chair. She could not understand why everyone was listening to her father but nobody was respecting him. She saw his shoulders tighten, and she saw the familiar expression he wore whenever life forced him to swallow pain. She quietly walked over and slipped her hand into his. Everett squeezed it gently. He told her they would be okay, even though he wasn't sure they would. Celeste finally told Everett that if he could not support the flight, he should step away from the project. Everett looked at the aircraft through the glass wall. For several seconds, his expression changed. It was almost as if he were seeing something from another life. His eyes moved across the control displays, then toward the storm clouds gathering over the distant runway. He noticed the wind direction, the pressure pattern, and the behavior of the aircraft during its last taxi test. He knew exactly what was happening, but he also knew nobody would listen to a man they had already decided was insignificant. So he took Maisie's hand and walked toward the exit. That should have been the end of it. But as Everett reached the door, one of the flight control screens suddenly flashed red. An alarm sounded. The aircraft's automated diagnostic system had detected an abnormal control response. Engineers rushed toward the console. Celeste froze. The same issue Everett had warned them about had appeared, but now it was worse. The demonstration flight had already been authorized, and the pilot was waiting on the runway. The control room erupted into confusion as people tried to determine whether the aircraft could safely return to the hangar. Everett stopped walking. He heard the alarm. He looked at the flight data. Then he looked at the storm. Something deep inside him woke up. He handed Maisie's backpack to a nearby employee and stepped toward the console. Celeste immediately demanded that he leave, but Everett ignored her. He studied the screen for only a few seconds before asking where the pilot was. Someone answered that the pilot was already airborne. Everett's face went pale. Then he whispered a call sign nobody in that room had heard in years. Rook 7. The room went completely silent. An older aviation consultant standing near the back slowly turned around. His face changed first to confusion, then disbelief. He stared at Everett as if he were looking at a ghost. He asked Everett to repeat the call sign. Everett did. The consultant's hand trembled. He explained that Rook 7 had been the legendary call sign of an emergency test pilot who had flown some of Northstar's most dangerous prototype missions nearly a decade earlier. The pilot had been credited with saving an experimental aircraft during a catastrophic systems failure and bringing the entire crew home safely. But after a terrible accident involving a different aircraft, the pilot had disappeared from the aviation world. His real identity had never been widely publicized. Celeste stared at Everett. For the first time that day, she looked beyond his uniform. She asked if he was Rook 7. Everett didn't answer immediately. He looked at Maisie, then at the aircraft data. Finally, he admitted that he had been that pilot. The room seemed to shrink around them. Celeste remembered every word she had said to him. She remembered calling him a maintenance worker. She remembered telling him he did not belong in the room. She remembered threatening to fire him because he refused to ignore a safety problem. But the emergency was still unfolding, and Everett had no time to enjoy being proven right. He stepped forward and began explaining what the aircraft was experiencing. His voice was calm, precise, and unmistakably authoritative. He knew the aircraft's behavior because he had once tested earlier versions of the same system. He knew how the control surfaces would react under pressure. He knew what the pilot was likely experiencing and, more importantly, he knew what would happen if the pilot followed the standard emergency procedure. Celeste listened. For the first time in her career, she did not interrupt. Everett guided the engineers through a manual override procedure. The aircraft stabilized. The pilot regained control. Minutes later, the jet returned safely to the runway and rolled to a stop. Everyone in the room exhaled. Maisie ran to her father and hugged him tightly. Everett knelt down and held her, closing his eyes for a moment. He had spent years trying to hide his past because he wanted his daughter to know him as her father, not as a legend. He had lost friends in aviation. He had walked away because one tragedy had convinced him that flying was no longer worth the price. He chose a quieter life fixing aircraft instead of flying them. He wanted Maisie to grow up believing that her father was simply someone who showed up when she needed him. Celeste stood several feet away, unable to speak. The woman who had commanded a room full of powerful people now looked like someone who had finally realized how badly she had misunderstood another human being. She approached Everett slowly. She did not offer him a promotion. She did not make excuses. She simply apologized. Everett accepted the apology, but he told her something she would remember for the rest of her life. He said that being wrong was not the worst thing that could happen to a person. Refusing to admit it was. Celeste's eyes filled with tears. She confessed that she had become so obsessed with being strong that she had forgotten what strength was supposed to protect. She had spent years believing that respect came from authority, money, and position. But watching Everett protect hundreds of lives without asking for recognition had shown her a different kind of leadership. She asked Everett to return to the project as a flight safety advisor. Everett hesitated. He looked at Maisie. His daughter smiled. So he agreed, but only on one condition. Safety decisions would never again be based on someone's position inside the company. Every technician, engineer, pilot, and worker would have the right to speak if they believed something was wrong. Celeste agreed. And she kept her promise. Over the following months, North Star changed. Employees who had once been afraid to question senior executives began speaking openly. Celeste became less interested in being the smartest person in the room and more interested in listening to the people who worked closest to the machines. Everett remained humble. He still carried his old toolbox. He still arrived early. He still packed Maisie's lunch. But something else changed. He began flying again. Not because he wanted fame. Not because he wanted to prove Celeste wrong. He flew because he finally realized that walking away from his gift had never erased the part of him that could save lives. One afternoon, months after the incident, Everett took Maisie to the runway. She stood beside him wearing oversized safety headphones while a small training aircraft waited nearby. She looked up at her father and asked whether he was nervous. Everett smiled. He told her that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was knowing something mattered enough to face the fear anyway. Maisie hugged him. Then Everett climbed into the aircraft. Before the engine started, he looked toward the control tower and saw Celeste standing there. She gave him a small nod. This time, there was no arrogance in her face. Only respect. And as Everett's aircraft lifted into the clear afternoon sky, Maisie watched proudly from the ground, holding the same purple backpack she had carried on the day everyone underestimated her father. That day had begun with a CEO mocking a single dad because of his dirty boots and humble job. It ended with that same CEO understanding something far more valuable than any business contract. You can never measure a person's worth by the uniform they wear, the position printed on their badge, or the mistakes they made in their past. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the greatest story. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who will save everyone when it matters most. And sometimes, the greatest second chance is not being given another opportunity by someone else, but finding the courage to believe in yourself again. Before we end, leave a meaningful comment telling us what lesson you took from Everett's story. Would you have forgiven Celeste after being humiliated in front of everyone, or would you have walked away forever? Your words might give hope to someone who is silently struggling with the same question. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes, the person we overlook is carrying the very strength we need, and sometimes, one act of humility can turn a painful mistake into the beginning of a beautiful second chance.